everyone. Welcome. I am here chatting with Connie Berry and Marty Wingate. I'm so glad you guys can all join us. We're going to just chat and have a lot of fun talking about books and our latest series and the UK. All of us love Britain. Just watch along. And if you have any comments or questions, please just pop them in the comments section below. And I will be checking throughout the event so we can find out, all your deepest questions you have for these ladies. So I'm going to start off by asking you ladies to just kind of introduce yourselves and tell us what you write. Some of the people are very familiar with you and some may not. So Connie, why don't you kick it off and tell us what you write?
Thanks, Anna. I am Connie Berry and I write the Kate Hamilton Mysteries. It is about an American antiques dealer in the UK. And there are 3 in the series. I just happen to have them here. The first book is called A Dream of Death. The second book is A Legacy of Murder. And the current book that just came out June 8th is The Art of Betrayal. And Kate is in a small village, fictional village in Suffolk called Long Barston. She is holding down the fort at a friend's antiquity shop while he recovers from hip surgery, and she's thrilled when a reclusive widow brings in a very fabulous Chinese Hunping jar, an ancient funereal jar, but she isn't so thrilled when the recluse is murdered and the jar is stolen.
All right, Marty, what about you?
Hi, I'm Marty Wingate, and I write both historical fiction and mysteries, but they're all set in Britain. My latest book is Glamour Girls. I have my books just at my shoulder here. We've all got our bookshelves arranged. Glamour Girls is the story of Rosalie Wright, who was a pilot during World War II. This is a historical fiction, but inspired by the women who flew for the Air Transport Auxiliary. They flew Spitfires and all sorts of airplanes all over Britain, delivering them from factory to RAF base or to the maintenance place, and so they were in the war and they saw the results of the war, but they weren't fighting. And in fact, when they flew those planes, they didn't have radar, they didn't have radio. They couldn't carry maps because what if you crashed and the Germans found a map? They had nothing, and so they had to fly really low. So a lot of times they flew between 500 and 1,000 feet and just found their way by following railroad tracks and things like that. So that's the background. This is a story of Rosalie. It's the story of her life from the beginning of the war to the end of the war, and I had a fabulous time writing that. So that was out in January, and my mystery series is the first edition library series set in Bath. It's set present day, it's not historical, and it concerns a library full of rare and collectible first editions from the golden age of mystery. So even though it's present day, I get to be inspired by Agatha Christie. The Bodies in the Library, book 1, had a Agatha Christie fan fiction writing group in it. And Dorothy L. Sayers' Murder is a Must, which came out in December, is inspired by Murder Must Advertise, my favorite Dorothy L. Sayers book. And book 3, which comes out in January, is The Librarian Always Rings Twice. And it is inspired by Daphne du Maurier, Frenchman's Creek. So.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
Fun. So I'd love for you guys to just kind of tell us a little bit about your background, where you grew up, what your family was like, whether you've had a career before writing, all those kind of things, what you're interested in. So Marty, why don't you kick that off?
Well, that's very interesting. Someone recently posted, things come through Facebook every once in a while. Someone recently posted, say what you wanted to be when you were a child. And I thought, well, isn't that very interesting? A writer. I put it down immediately. Now, between reading Little Women and wanting to be Jo March, and about 10 years ago, I actually was a writer for part of that, but I wandered through. I have a bachelor's degree in drama, And then I have a master's degree in speech pathology. So I was a speech therapist for many years, working with moderately and severely handicapped children. I lived in Ireland for a while doing that. I came back. I moved up to Seattle, was still in that career, started taking other classes, ended up with a master's in urban horticulture, and then became a garden writer. So I wrote garden how-to articles and books. And from there, don't tell me how it happened. Don't ask me how it happened. I have no idea. I just sort of ended up in fiction. And
that's wonderful. That's so funny. I did not realize that about you, about the speech and everything. My sister is a speech and language pathologist. So
does she work in schools or in a hospital?
She works in a hospital with like elderly, so elderly care. So lots of swallow studies and things like that. So
oh, there you are. I know about it.
It's wonderful. How about you, Connie?
Yeah, I know. Listening to Marty, it's funny the way life sends you in different paths. So what I wanted to do when I was little was I wanted to be an archaeologist. I wanted to find lost pharaohs' tombs in Egypt. And of course, my idea of this would be everyone else would do all the hard work in the heat of the sun, and I would come in, like Howard Carter, and just break in at the last minute and find all this fabulous stuff. But when I realized that wasn't going to happen, and I would actually have to probably sweat and do a lot of digging, I kind of segued over into English literature. But I started out loving to write as a child, and I wrote a lot of stories, and I actually illustrated them. I'm not an artist, but I had all these pictures, and my mom, who saved everything, saved a lot of them. And so I still have them, and they're actually pretty funny, some of them. But the interesting thing is they all contain some kind of a mystery. Now, there weren't murders in them, but some puzzle or some unknown thing or some, secret that had to be discovered. And that is what I always love. I love history. I have a master's in English, and also I have a degree in English history. I studied at St. Clara's College in Oxford, where I totally fell under the spell of the British Isles, and I've always loved that. But then for my career, I taught theology for 25 years. And that was very intense because there was a lot of study and a lot of preparation, and I delivered a 50-minute lecture every week. And so writing kind of took a back seat. And then when I retired 4 years ago, I decided to go full-time writing. And that's when I started my writing career, a whole new career.
That's wonderful.
Anna, tell us about you, though.
So, I think every writer can tell stories about when they were a kid. I think we all started when we were kids. I just feel like we did. And like, we all have these notebooks that are like hidden under the bed somewhere. I had the same thing. I had like a series that was inspired by Nancy Drew, and one that was inspired by Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego, and like all these different things. They were always little mysteries, just like you were saying. So I wanted to be a writer. I wanted to be a singer. My degree is actually in music. I went that route for a while. I lived in Nashville, and I lived in Nashville, but I got my degree in classical performance, like opera. So you never know. Anyway, and so I pursued that for a while, and then I kind of fell back into writing kind of as a stress release. And then I just once I got back into it, I just fell in love with it again, and just kind of went from there. And just, that's how I came back to writing, I guess is what I would say. But yeah, I've pretty much lived, I grew up in Ohio, and then I lived in South Carolina and Tennessee for a little while, and then I'm back up in Indiana. So I've always kind of lived close to where my family is. I have a big family, so it's important for me to be close to them. So, but then we love to travel and, head off and then come back. So, you were talking about the archaeology, and it's funny because the antiques are a little bit like archaeology. Do you have a background in antiques? Because I love in your series all these antiques things that you include. Those things are fascinating to me. I love learning about all the history and stuff that you talk about.
Yeah, that was the way I grew up. My father was raised by his grandparents, his Scottish grandparents, on the Rockefeller summer home mansion in Lakewood, New Jersey. And his grandparents were caretakers of a guest house, but they weren't there very much. And so my father was inside the big mansion a lot. And as a child, really a boy, he saw this room in there they call the Chinese room. And the Chinese room had all of these pieces of Chinese art and antiquity. So my parents were antique dealers. Now, my father was an engineer by trade, but as a hobby, and people always assumed it was my mom that got him into it, but it wasn't. It was my dad. He was passionate about objects of great value and workmanship. And so that's the way I grew up. So our house was like a warehouse, actually. We had all kinds of weird things, like for a year and a half, we had a life-size marble bust of Marie Antoinette sitting in our living room. And we had a huge statue of the Three Graces for a while, and a Chinese nodder, which I don't think I have time to explain, but kind of odd things. And to me, it was perfectly normal. This is just the way we lived. But I found out later that my friends thought it was really creepy. It was really, really weird. But
this reminds me of my friend who lived in a few old
like, yeah. So that's the world that I grew up in. And my parents instilled in me a love for these objects. And I've never, really collected them. I just have the things that have been in my family.
That's really neat. Like, I love how there's so many things in our lives that unexpectedly influence us in different ways, So, Marty, I love the Atta Girls, reading about them and everything. That's so much fun. What kind of drew them to you? Drew you to them?
Well, it started out, I was actually inspired by Mary Wilkins Ellis, who died in 2018. She was 101, and she was one of the pilots. Rosalie is sort of based on her. She was in the news all over the place. One of the last female pilots in the ATA, and it was, my agent said, oh, here's an idea. I had an idea for historical fiction. I was interested in getting into that as well as continuing my mysteries. And so I'm writing the first idea I had, I'm writing now. But my agent said, what about this? So I thought, this is really interesting because everybody loves World War II stuff. It's just fascinating. And to find the women's stories in World War II is just, there's so much there. And so when I read more about the ATA and I read Mary Wilkins' autobiography, which is just charming, I certainly recommend it to everyone. She was a very exacting woman, though. And every time she's telling this story about flying a Spitfire from her base, Hamble, to, somewhere else in Sussex, or she would tell you that she would list the ID number of the plane. So this is kind of, it's the kind of thing that your editor doesn't want you to do. It disrupts the flow, but it didn't matter because this is just her. So I was fascinated about that. They were called Atta Girls. That's right, the men, the ATA men, because this was a civilian corps, and a lot of the men that were pilots were former pilots. It might have been World War I pilots. They might be disabled in some way. They'd take anybody to fly these planes. And they were known as the ATA, the Ancient and Tattered Airmen. So that's why nobody said, you got a pilot in here that has only one eye. I don't think that would have happened. I was waiting for somebody to ask me that question. Nobody ever did, which is good, because I can say, yes, I can tell you who it was that flew with one eye. They had a pilot with one arm. So it was a fascinating, close-knit group. Again, civilians. They were a part of the war, but not in battle. But that doesn't mean that they didn't encounter.
Oh, right.
They didn't fly through a dogfight in the middle of the air or worry about V1 or V2 rockets when they were flying along. So, and of course it was set in England. So I loved that. And in fact, you know, it's driving me crazy, these Facebook 2 years ago memories coming back to me, because 2 years ago we went to Maidenhead, which was that was the base for the ATA, and they have a fabulous museum there, and they have a Spitfire simulator, and I got to fly the Spitfire simulator. It was
that's
really
wonderful.
cool. That plane, I mean, the cockpit of that plane is not big. There's just a one-person plane, and there's guys standing next to me helping, and after a half an hour, I thought, nobody would ever want to get in an airplane if I was the pilot. I'll tell you that right now. I admire them so much for what they did. So it was just a wonderful story. And I got to incorporate things that I remember my husband's dad telling us, because he was on an American base. He was sent over there and he was part of the grounds crew, and he would tell us stories of the war.
That's really interesting. Yeah. So tell me, I guess, a little bit, I don't know, Marty, you might have told us a little bit here, but what was your inspiration kind of behind these books? I mean, you told us the memoir, but Connie, what about you? What was kind of your backstory? Where did the idea for your latest Kate Hamilton book come from?
The latest one, the Art of Betrayal. So in every book, there is some object, some fabulous object that Kate comes in contact with, and there were a couple. One was this Chinese hunping jar, and they were from the Han Dynasty, which was approximately 200 BC to 200 AD. The Hans ruled most of China, and they had funereal customs, and they had these elaborate jars, and some of them would have figures and like slices of life and just interesting things. Some of them were very plain. None of them ever held human remains. So people are kind of wondering what they were used for. And the best idea that the scholars have right now is that they were supposed to act as a kind of a portal to draw the energy of the deceased individual and kind of send them off into wherever they were going, but no two alike have ever been found. And so it is thought that the deceased person probably commissioned his own. So that was one. And then the other was an event in 1860, the sacking of the old summer palace in Beijing. And Lord Elgin was in charge of the British troops, and they were trying to negotiate peace with the emperor, and they had some emissaries who were captured and tortured and killed. And in retribution, Lord Elgin decided that they were just going to level this beautiful, beautiful imperial palace in Beijing, the summer palace. And they did. It took 3 days, and they reduced it to ashes and rubble. And many of the objects were actually taken by soldiers and made their way into private collections and museums all around the world. This was such a humiliation for China that people don't realize today in negotiations with China, this humiliation still plays a part.
Wow.
In fact, a few years ago, in the Chinese constitution, they made it a mandate to repatriate their objects of their history. And so they have been demanding them back. They have been trying to buy them back, wealthy Chinese individuals. Some, although they don't admit it, probably have been stolen, because there have been a number of these objects stolen from museums and private collections. And so that was kind of the backdrop for this particular book.
That's really interesting.
Yeah,
I didn't know about any of that.
Yeah, it's a sad story, but it's not an uncommon story.
Yeah, it's listening to you. The latest book I'm writing right now for the Lady Darby series, it's she's an art portrait artist, and so I kind of deep dived into art forgery and antiquity forgery and stuff. It kind of plays a role in the plot, and I was learning all this stuff, all of these antiquities, how many were just pillaged from places, especially by wealthy British, wealthy French, wealthy Americans, in different time periods, and we don't realize how many of the objects we now have came because they're basically stolen, so it's kind of.
Yeah, but there is another side to that too. True. Because in the cultures, oftentimes the people would not value the old things.
Very
And
true.
so they would, for example, in the Parthenon, people were taking parts of the marble and the stone and making their own houses out of them. And so the justification was that we are preserving these fine objects for the future. So that is one side of it. The other side of it is that they just actually took the things, and so some of it has been repatriated.
Very true. Very true. Yes. Yeah. I guess I'm thinking of the time period I'm writing in, and just different. Anyway, the objects I'm working with. But yeah, you're absolutely right. So, if you guys have questions that you are watching, go ahead and pop them in the comments. I will be checking every once in a while, so I just want to plug that again. I want to talk to you guys about we all write in Britain, so we've all traveled in Britain. Tell me about some of your favorite experiences in the UK. What made you choose the locations that you use in your books? What drew you to them? Marty, why don't you go?
Well, the first thing I'll say is, here's how Connie and I met. We were on a panel a few years ago, and we discovered that we wrote about the same village in Suffolk. In one of my early series, I chose a village in Suffolk and renamed it. And Connie chose the same village and renamed it. So
that's so funny.
That's our tie there. Yeah. Of course, for Glamour Girls, I had a very, not only was the timeline structure already set for me, but a lot of the setting was chosen.
Right.
Now I got to choose which RAF base Rosalie was flying in and out of to meet whoever she was meeting. But she was stationed at number 15 Ferry Pool, Hamble, which is near Southampton, and that's where Mary Wilkins Ellis was. So I used a lot of the very same places. I had Rosalie, my character, grow up on a farm outside of Cambridge, and Mary Wilkins grew up on a farm outside of Oxford. So I was pretty close there. I did, you know how it is, if you're traveling in Britain and you want to try and imagine some particular historical era, you can find the building still existing. And that's what's so fabulous. And also, the open air museums that they have in Britain are absolutely wonderful. Beamish, we've been to Beamish, and you want to see what a row of shops looked like in the 40s, walk in this one right here. I just love that. So that was really fun. And I visited a former airfield. It was a farm before the war. This is in Suffolk as well. Suffolk's flat, and it was a really great place to have a lot of RAF bases and American bases too. And my husband's father was stationed at Lavenham, and really close to Long Melford. And we have been back. It's a farm again, as so many of the places turned back into farm, but they kept the tracks and they kept some of the Nissen huts.
Oh, neat.
Control tower. Not all control towers are still there. These people kept the control tower and have rented it out for office spaces. And I think that's fabulous, because that means it's going to stay. And we have stood on top of the roof. We've stood on the roof at the control tower where Leighton's dad was stationed, and
Aww.
he's the one that told us about how they would go up there and count the planes in coming back from a mission. And so I used that in Glamour Girls, because most of the time not everybody did come back.
Right.
So those places were very real to me, and we still love visiting them. For my first two series, the Potting Shed series, it was just fun because it was an American in Britain. And so I got to choose wherever I wanted her to go. She got a garden job there. And then Suffolk for my second series. But now with the First Edition Society, when I started that series, I thought, well, where is someplace different? Where's a place Prue in Potting Shed hasn't been? A place that Julia in the Birds of a Feather series hasn't been. And we love Bath. And so I chose Bath. And so now it just makes sense to me that, because the woman whose library this was, she died 3 years before The Bodies in the Library came out, that in the time. She was 94 lived a great old life. But Lady Fowling is still very much a character. She's not a ghost or anything, but she's still very much a presence in the series. And so if someone says, well, why would the Golden Age of Mystery Library be in Babbitt? That's where Lady Fowling lived. It wasn't my choice. It was my character. It's lovely to blame things on characters, isn't it? So, now we get to use Bath, and I do get to use some of Cornwall and Devon, especially in book 3 for Daphne du Maurier.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah, that was fun.
I've been to Bath. I love it. It's, anybody who's a Jane Austen fan, it's like, I got to go to Bath, you know?
That's exactly what my agent said to me was, is it going to be about Jane Austen? And I said, there is enough Jane out there, let me tell you. And so I do, Haley Burke, who is the curator at the First Edition Library, formerly worked at the Jane Austen Center. So in the office, she didn't have to wear a costume, because if you work anywhere in the tea room, in the rooms, in the shop, you have to wear a costume. And in fact, there's a mannequin of Jane out on the pavement outside the front door. You may remember seeing it.
I think so, yeah.
It's very much a Jane place, yes.
How about you, Connie? What made you choose you were in Scotland for the first book in the Kate Hamilton series, and then you've been in Suffolk, and kind of what are some fascinating places to you about the UK, and why did you choose those settings also?
Yeah, well, I'm going to tell you, but I want you to tell us too, because when you were talking before, I was just wondering, I wonder how she decided to set her books in the UK. But, well, first of all, I had Scottish grandparents. And so from my earliest memories, and they had come over as adults. My grandmother, my father's mother, had come over actually to work for the Rockefellers, because old John D. Rockefeller liked Scottish servants. For some reason, he maybe thought they were more honest or more something or another, but he liked them. And so her parents, my great-grandparents, her sister, and my grandmother all came over to work, first at Pocantico and then in Lakewood, New Jersey. So I grew up with the sound of the Scottish brogue, and I grew up having, every time we went there, we had to have our tea, but it was more than that. It was their whole lives were wrapped up, like, instead of moving from Scotland to the United States, they lived in Buffalo, New York, they took Scotland with them. And they had all these friends. So their entire friendship group were all Scottish people. And my grandparents were champion lawn bowlers, and they were all Scottish people too. And so that's, from the earliest time, everything British was better, according to my grandparents. And so with that background, then, of course, I loved English literature. As a child, I discovered P.G. Wodehouse and Jerome K. Jerome and Agatha Christie and Cyril Hare and all the other golden agers. So I loved that, majored in that, went to graduate school. But I also went to college in Oxford and studied the modern novel. And so actually being there was really instrumental in that. But I just love being there, and it's got to be because of the history, because I love history so much. And when you're there, like Marty said, it's there. You are living it, you are seeing it, and history you scratch anywhere in the UK, and I suppose this is true a lot of places too, but history is there, and Suffolk is such an historical area because of the Vikings, the Anglo-Saxon culture, Normans, and so that's partly why I love it. It's not spectacular in scenery, although it's very lovely, but I just love that. And my favorite moment that I can think of, I was researching for my second book, and I wanted to have a scene up on the rooftop of a grand stately home. And I got to thinking, well, I don't know, can you get up on the rooftop from inside? How would you do that? So we were staying at a grand stately home. And so I said, you've got a rooftop up there. Can you get there? And they said, and I told them why I wanted to know. And they said, well, sure, come on. So they took me up. I took all these pictures. So here I am, you know, and first of all, I've got acrophobia, so I'm afraid of heights. So here I am out here on this slippery slate, you know, roof with like ladders going up and all of this stuff. And so when I wrote the scene, I could really pull up all those feelings. So I love that, and I'm kind of proud of myself that I did it because it was kind of scary.
That's awesome. Yeah. So for me, I get asked this a lot. Why did I pick the UK? And I never have a good answer. I just love it. I mean, I do. I just really love it. And I like the history. I think a big part of the history, it just fascinates me. Like you were talking about, Connie, I just love it. And there is so much history there, and there's so much tradition, I guess, maybe of mystery and romance and all these things, you know. And Scotland in particular is always called to me. And when we visited there, you know, I talk about this, and a lot of people can relate to it, but it sometimes when you go to a place, it's a very strange thing, but it almost feels like you've been there before. It's almost like a memory in your DNA kind of thing. And so when I was in the Highlands, that's how I felt. I just felt like this is the first time I've been here, but I feel like I've been here, you know. So I just love Scotland. And you know, I'm a very atmospheric author. Like I have like a Gothic feel to a lot of my books. And so you know, there's so many settings in the UK and Scotland in particular that lend itself to that atmosphere. And it's so varied. I mean, you can go such a short distance and the landscape can be so different. So, I mean, I have, you know, when we were there the first time, we rented a car and we just kind of drove all over the place. And it was a fabulous experience, and it was fabulous for my writing because I ended up going to all these different places I've been able to use in my books. And, you know, like you said, we went to this really old castle that was out in the Scottish Highlands, and like it was run down, but you could go to it. You could just hike up to it. And like, we were the only ones there, but like I gleaned so much from that experience, you know, just how the steps are worn in the middle from people, you know, those stone steps going, I mean, things you don't, unless you've been there, you wouldn't absorb, you know what I mean? So, and I always thought, how do these ladies in these heavy dresses and skirts not fall? I mean, all these steps, you know, and, you know, the spiders in the corners. And I mean, just all these things, you know, that play into the books. And yeah, so for me, yeah, I never have a good answer, but that's the answer. So,
Anna, Edinburgh is my favorite city in the world. And so it's lovely to have, it's sort of Lady Darby's, you know, although
she goes back to.
Yeah. Well, I do, you know, she goes off to Ireland and goes here and goes up there. So that's always nice. I love Scotland.
I do too. And I was going to say, Anna, with your coloring, you belong there. I can see you in your plaids. I definitely can.
Yeah, my genetics tell me that's where my ancestors are from. My DNA tells me that's where my ancestors are from. Yeah. So yeah, so UK, and I did want to ask, just because I get asked this a lot, if someone was traveling, a lot of people will travel there and they'll ask me, you know, where should I go? You know, and I love to give them ideas of like kind of off the beaten path places to go that I've been, because anybody can say, you know, London, anybody can say Oxford, you know, I mean, certain things. So do you have any places that you just loved that you went to that are kind of off the beaten path that you highly recommend for anybody who's traveling there to just check out? Either of you can pop in.
Well, any place in Suffolk, it's like Connie said, you know, I mean, we love the villages there. And we often go to the coast. In fact, that's where my work in progress is set in Southwold on the coast, with the North Sea blowing in your face as you walk down. So I often attach places to go with something I've read. So for example, I've told people about Southwold, but also Walberswick, which is right across the river. And there's a lovely book called Mr. Mac and Me that's set in Walberswick just before the First World War. So this is like before Verity. And it's historical fiction about Charles Rennie Mackintosh and his wife coming down from Glasgow, which they did, and lived there for 2 or 3 years during the war. And it's told from the point of view of this little boy who doesn't know anything about art, but learns, because they're drawing at that point. They're drawing wildflowers and things like that. So I attach things, oh, you should go to Walberswick. Walberswick is very nice. And often, rock stars from London come up and buy a house. But it doesn't look like that. It looks like a little village. So we stayed down in Cornwall at a village called Looe, Looe. There's East Looe and West Looe. And it's popular with British holidaymakers. They'll come down there for 3-day weekends, for holiday weekends, but not necessarily for tourists from elsewhere. You can walk along parts of the coastal path there. Any place that has a walking path, I'll recommend, because it's so much fun.
Oh yeah, I know. Like they have so many wonderful hiking trails, like walking paths in the UK. I mean, that just go through the whole country. I mean, there's like the Southwest Coast path. You can just walk the whole, I mean, it's amazing. The Highland Way path. I mean, I'm always like on my bucket list. I'm like, yeah, someday I'm going to just like take a year and walk all these paths,
I do one of the walks where somebody else takes your bag for you to the next city, and there's a pub along the way.
Absolutely necessary. Well, I've always said that Marty and I must have been separated at birth because we have so many things in common. And the book that I'm working on right now that's going to be out next June takes place on the Suffolk coast. It is an abandoned Victorian insane asylum. They called it a lunatic asylum then. And it is being turned into, like Holloway, which maybe you've heard because of Bill Bryson, being turned into upscale flats and townhouses. So there's that on the coast, which is right near the Devon estuary, all made up, obviously. But what was the question? I've forgotten the question.
Places for travelers. Any place they should visit.
Yeah. Okay. Well, one place I love in Suffolk is Sutton Hoo. And I love that movie that was just out not too long ago about that. That was a fabulous story about that. But that was so interesting because of the Anglo-Saxon culture. But because I love history, and the closer I can get to history, the better. My very favorite house in all of Great Britain so far is Lanhydrock. And yes. And the reason I love that is because I think it was in the 1600s. No, I can't remember when it was built, but in the very early Victorian age, they had a terrible fire and it destroyed a lot of things. Family was very wealthy, and so they rebuilt the house from the ground up. The stone was there, but inside, and they put in it every modern convenience, the latest in plumbing and the kitchens and everything, the latest of that very age. So it's all of a piece. And then nothing happened ever again because the family just kind of went down, and they ended up with a brother and a sister who had never been married, never had children, and they lived there up until their 90s or 80s or something. Nothing had ever changed.
Wow.
So it is exactly the same as it was back in, I think, I'm trying to remember, but I think it was the early Victorian reign, or even just before that. But it really is like walking into a time capsule. Yeah. And so that, it just like fires my imagination. I just love it. It's actually like, it's the closest thing to time travel.
That's really neat. I've never been there, but I've always wanted to go there.
Yeah, it's outstanding. It's stunning.
Well, we do have a question or two. Let's see here. When creating your settings, do you have something in mind and then go find a place so you can specifically picture it and so describe it, or the other way around? Do you travel, see a place, and adapt it to your setting? I think it's a combination for me. I mean, sometimes it's sometimes I travel to a place and I just love it so much I find a way to put it in the book. And then other times it's, I need this to happen and they're going to be near here or whatever, and then I incorporate it. So I mean, do you guys find the same, or?
I think so. I find that with places we've been, I'll think, oh, I can use this, and you just kind of file it away. And then you can think, when you do need a place, then you think, all right, now what do I have in my filing cabinet in my brain that I can pull out? But I think we do that the same. This is a little off track, but I think we do that the same with characters and with dialogue too.
Absolutely.
I used in the first edition library mysteries in Murder is a Must. I was standing in a little coffee shop on the Pulteney Bridge in Bath. Has great views of the Weir, and a young woman came up to the counter to order, and she said, I'll have 1 Earl Grey tea and 1 normal tea. And I thought, I'm using that, let me tell you, because personally, I don't drink Earl Grey tea. I drink Builder's tea. Yorkshire Gold is my favorite. But so I had this elaborate order for one of the characters in Murder is a Must. It's Earl Grey, but it can't be in the bag. So open the bag and you have to slice the lemon. I thought, let's push it. We can always push it a little further, But I think we all just store those things away for use at a later time.
Absolutely.
I don't know that I so much use actual places. I mean, I know Elizabeth George does. If you're familiar with,
yeah,
her, she actually goes and photographs, and like if she wants something to happen in a barn, she will actually find a barn and take pictures of it. And I've never done that. I think it's more like both of you, where I'm drawing on my memories, but I don't ever use a place, I don't think, exactly as it actually was. I think I always shape it and form it to fit what I want, which is the wonderful thing about fiction. You can change a town, you can change the direction, you can change the buildings. So even though Marty and I both have used Long Melford, my Long Melford and hers would not be the same at all.
Yeah. I will say, for historical fiction, and I'm interested to find out what you do about this, Anna, because we do have this framework. It's like I had the war for Glamour Girls, and last March we were going to spend 3 weeks in England as I checked out Hamble, which is this still a little village where the ferry pool was, and there's still remnants left and some monuments and stuff, but mostly it's a very high-priced little marina. I mean, we were going to specific places where I knew Rosalie had been, and
yeah,
so in my head now.
Yeah, I find writing historical, it can get tricky because, some of the places are still there, but some of them are very different from the way they looked 200 years ago, or, those kind of things. So it's like, you can't really go there, kind of thing. Or I even had a little bit of a headache in the Verity Cat book 4 out last year, because I was I'm writing in the modern era, writing about 1919, and then I'm also talking about things from the Roman era that they're visiting. So I'm like, okay, so what did it look like this time, and then this time, and now this time? It's like, it can get a little, there's a lot to keep straight to try to get right. And I mean, yeah, it's a little trying to realize how things looked in certain eras, it can get a little tricky. Yeah.
Yeah, and then when you're writing historical fiction, there are these pesky things such as historical facts that you have to take into account.
Right. I didn't try to change VE Day. I kept it the same.
Yeah.
I think you would have got a lot of letters.
Yeah. So, yeah.
So I want to talk about the protagonists of your cozy series, your Kate Hamilton and your first edition, Kate and Haley. They're both a little more mature. They're in their 40s, and they're either divorced or widowed with grown children, which I just love. I love both of those series. And And I love that about the protagonists, because they have more experience, they have more things to draw from. I feel like I end up reading a lot of things where the protagonists are younger. So it's nice to see women that are, a little more mature and, exploring different stages of their life and stuff. And, what made you decide to utilize a heroine that was a little bit older than sometimes people use? I mean, in their 40s and that, and what kind of drew you to that, and what do you find are the advantages of that? I guess tell us about your series a little bit, because I know a lot of people are saying, tell us a little more about your mysteries. So I'm kind of trying to draw that out, and your heroines are big parts of that. So,
Connie?
Yeah. Well, obviously, Kate and I share a lot in common because we have a very similar background. It's funny how things work out that way. But honestly, I have to say that if I were trying to write a protagonist in their 20s or maybe even in their 30s, I think I'd be lost. I don't feel like I could understand their thinking. And so I feel like I can understand Kate. I know how she thinks and how she feels, and I've got to know her better as I've written about her. But I think it's true, Anna, that with a protagonist who has some life experience, Kate has suffered losses in her life, and that plays a part in how she deals with the present. And she has had influences in her life, and she's dealing with adult children right now, and she's now dealing with a romance that is on 2 different continents. And what will that mean? She has a widowed mother that she can't just abandon. So her life is pulled in different directions, and her heart is telling her one thing, her head is telling her the other. So that to me is just interesting. It
makes for a lot of really good content.
Yeah. And I even though my series is, I don't know if it's a cozy, I don't really think of it as a real cozy.
I know it's the tricky thing. It's not gory, so it's a cozy, but
right.
It
has cozy characteristics.
Right.
But more, Marty could probably talk about this too, more the golden age characteristics. Mm-hmm. Now we're calling them cozy, but it really goes back to those golden agers. And
right.
So more of a traditional mystery in the golden age tradition. And I think probably, Marty, you'd say the same thing.
I do, in fact, usually introduce the series as a traditional mystery series, and that's what Kate Hamilton is too.
That's a great title. That's a great way to say it. Yeah.
And I think it's only because, the genre has divided and divided again, and we can all find our little space, and readers can read across the board.
Right.
But I agree with what Connie said about choosing an older character, because there's so much more to draw on. There's so many layers, and there is more conflict, like you said, Anna. Haley Burke is divorced, and she has a daughter in her early 20s. Divorced since, let's see, Dinah, I think, was 11 when Haley and her husband were divorced. He was unfaithful. And he shows up now. He actually hasn't shown up in person, but he's shown up on the phone sometimes, and I really have fun with that. And so Haley really had to whip herself into shape. Her mother is still alive. Her mother had her own problems at the time because she went into a second marriage that wasn't a good idea. That's sort of it's part of the background subplot sometimes. But Haley was working at the Great Western Railway Museum in Swindon. And when she was divorced, and then got this job at the Jane Austen Center in Bath. And so this was a real turnaround and she and Dinah went off. Dinah's now, I would say that Haley felt really bad for her daughter, to lose her. She's still in touch with her father, but he's just really sort of, and so she might have made up for that by being a little overindulgent with her daughter. Dinah's a lovely girl, but she did take 2 gap years. She went to uni. And she's now at Sheffield and studying the history of everyday life. So, well, what kind of job are you going to get with that? Oh, yeah, it doesn't matter. Haley, it doesn't matter for Haley. So Haley's had a lot of money problems as well as infidelity in a previous marriage. And so she's got all that baggage dragging along, and she doesn't know anything about the golden age of mystery. That's the other problem at the beginning.
I found that a hoot. I found that to be a hoot.
Absolutely nothing. And she got the job because the society was in dire straits. And she happened to know someone on the board, a good friend, Adele, who got her the job. So Haley's pedaling like crazy to try to keep up, and has to work with a woman who is secretary for life of the first edition society, because she was personal assistant to Lady Fowling. And so as far as Mrs. Woolgar is concerned, if Lady Fowling didn't say it or say it should be done, it shouldn't be done. Everything should just stand exactly the way it was when Lady Fowling was alive. So it's a little hard for Haley to push things forward with the society. Makes for great. Oh, and then there's Lady Fowling's nephew, Charles Henry Dill,
Yes.
who is a problem in the first book and is sort of in the background in the second book. And he's a big problem in book 3 coming out in January. He's one of those really fun, horrible characters. Horrible.
I also love that you guys both have a romance thrown in, which I'm partial to. I love mysteries that have romance. I just love it. And I think they add so much to the stories,
Exactly.
I mean,
exactly.
So I love Tom and Val. I know.
I know. And, I think, and I love your series for that too, Hannah, because you've got not immediately, but fairly soon, there is romance that's continuing, and then you have to introduce problems with it. But I think that that's really fun. I love a good romance, and that's why, things aren't smooth sailing with Haley and Val. But he is divorced or a widower. It depends on when the papers were signed. No, papers weren't signed, so he's a widower with adult twin daughters. And so daughters with a stepmother, that can be, they're not married. Val and Haley aren't married, but, another woman in his life, that can be difficult. So but it's fun to go through.
Yeah, absolutely. I just think it adds so much. There's, it's just fun. And it's like real life. I mean, we all have our romantic entanglements, and it adds, complications and depth and all those kind of things. It's just fun. And I love, the initial romance is always fun, but it's nice to get to explore relationships that are more long-term, because, we're married for 20 years, you still have things come up, you're married for 50 years, you still have things come up, so it's like our real life.
And Connie, that was a smooth move, making Kate's romantic interest the policeman, because now you've got
very smart.
Yeah, that, the problem with an amateur sleuth is that you can't arrest people. And so if you're an amateur sleuth, you have to have some kind of a relationship, either an adversarial one or a cooperative one with the police, because at some point, if you're going to solve the crime, I'm talking now about mysteries and crime fiction, not historical fiction, but you have to turn things over. And Tom is, and I've had a lot of people comment on this, and I didn't set out to make it this way, but people have commented that what we appreciate is that Tom sees Kate's gifts and isn't too proud to use them.
I love that about him, because too often we see like let me handle it, you know what I mean? But he's very accepting of her help, you know what I mean? I mean, within reason, obviously, but I love that. I love that. Yeah. I think it was a smart move, because it's the opposite from what we expect.
Yeah.
Or what we've grown to expect.
And then the other common thing is when the police are idiots, and so the amateur sleuth has to come in and solve it because the police are just absolute idiots.
Right.
And, I don't like that.
I don't either.
I'm
Yeah.
not worried about the bumbling policeman.
Yeah. Yeah. I know even with my historicals, it's like you have to balance it because in the era I write, there are some places where the police was just established and there's other places where there is no police. And so it is kind of realistic that the person who's in charge really doesn't know what they're doing, so that's a little easier.
So, Anna, how do you go about researching police in the early 19th century?
It's tricky because, and it depends on where I'm at. So Edinburgh had a police force established. London just had their metropolitan police force established in 1829, but it's very different from now. I mean, I'll read books set around my era and it's a lot of people get it wrong because they assume it's like it is now, but it wasn't, so it's tricky, but like the small villages and things, they didn't necessarily have a police force. They had to have an act of parliament to establish a police force. It didn't become a common thing until either later in the 30s or the 40s of 1830, 1840s. So we haven't got to there yet. So yeah, it's tricky, but also I can play with it. You know what I mean? So I can be like, well, this fictional village doesn't have a police force, so, or they do, or whatever, whatever I happen to want to happen. It was still the magistrates, which was a lot of times whoever the local aristocrat was, or things like that. Or in Scotland, it gets a little tricky because it's the procurator fiscal instead of, all these different things. So it's tricky, but also can work to my advantage because it was so a little bit wishy-washy. So yeah. Those are the things we encounter. So you have to make it work to your advantage. I did have someone ask, does anybody have a book set in Wales? I don't think. No, sorry. Sorry. Whoever asked.
It'd be a great idea.
I know. Add it to the list, right?
Interesting.
There's so many wonderful places in Wales. I've been to Wales, but I haven't. I am a little bit intimidated just because of the era that my books would be in. So it'd be a little tricky, so yeah, but modern maybe would be, I don't know, it would be just like Britain pretty much close. Right. Anyway, the rest of it.
No, I've seen Hinterland. I don't think it would be like Britain.
That's true. How do you figure out what era you want to write about in mysteries? Well, I guess for me, I can say that, my Lady Darby series, I picked the era because of her background is really what informed it, because, Lady Darby's first husband was an anatomist and she got her training by him forcing her to sketch his dissections for an anatomy textbook he was writing. And so, I wanted to set it in the era of Burke and Hare, the body snatchers turned murderers. And so all of the scandal, it ups the conflict, I guess. So that's kind of how I settled on 1830. And then, of course, because Verity was a spy in World War I, that chose my era for that. So, but what about, and I guess World War II, you're writing about a World War II set, for the Glamour Girls, you would have to do that era.
Yeah, that it's a time period that isn't so far removed that it doesn't seem familiar, and I was very interested in kind of like Verity being a spy, but Rosalie's not a spy, but being a pilot in the war, and the women's role and how they were treated, because all the women were, the glamour girls. See, Rosalie's not a glamour girl, so that's the kind of play there. But there were a lot of women. They wouldn't get out of the plane. The ground crew's coming up. They'd land the plane. They'd put their lipstick on, and then they get out. But that wasn't everyone. But it was very much the press treated the women as glamour girls. Wear your skirts the day we're going to have the press come out, because the women wore their trousers most of the time. And so I was interested to read about them, and a lot of most of the women at the end of the war, as in all their jobs that they took during World War II, probably World War I too. All right, back to
yeah, absolutely.
And I was pleased to have Mary Wilkins as an inspiration, because after the war, she got married and she and her husband ran a private airport on the Isle of Wight.
Oh,
So
wonderful.
she kept flying.
I know that was the thing that really drew me to writing about Verity and the spies, that the women who worked for British intelligence, because, you know, most people, when you think of World War I female spies, all you can think of is Mata Hari, or maybe Edith Cavell, the nurse, you know, who was killed in Brussels. And people don't realize there were hundreds and thousands of women who worked for British intelligence within Britain and, you know, in the German occupied areas and all these places, the foreign offices, because they were told to keep quiet. And then after the war, they were sent home, and some of them did stay and work, but they were told to keep quiet and they kept quiet. And then when the records were released in the 2000s, all this came out and people were like, oh my gosh, my great grandmother was a spy. You know what I mean? Because they kept their mouths shut. They were, you know, the Secrets Act and everything. So I was like, we need to know about these women. I mean, that they did their part and then they kept their mouth quiet, you know. So just, there's so many interesting stories from war. I mean, even before World War I, you know, the contributions that women made and all of that. So I guess I'm passionate about that. So yeah. It comes through. Well, we're almost finished. If you have a question, go ahead and pop it in. But I want to ask you guys for one last question from me. You know, what do you have coming up next? I know, Connie, your third Kate Hamilton book just came out, which is The Art of
Betrayal.
There we go. I was like,
yeah.
What is up next for you?
Yeah, I have a new book. I'm in edits with it right now. It will be called The Shadow of Memory, and it is coming out in June of 2022. And I'm really having fun with it.
And it's the next Kate Hamilton, is that right?
It's the next Kate Hamilton, yeah. Right. In the back of my mind, I have an historical mystery. I don't know whether it will ever do anything, but I have an idea back here. So we'll see what happens. Yeah.
That's wonderful. What about you, Marty? What's coming up?
Well, I mentioned book 3 in the first edition library series out in January, and it does have a Daphne du Maurier Frenchman's Creek connection. As it turns out, they begin to open to the public at the first edition library. So there's an open afternoon on Wednesdays. In the very first afternoon, this man shows up who says that he is Lady Fowling's grandson. This is at the very beginning of the book, and Lady Fowling had no children. And yet he knows everything about it. And so that's the mystery there. And I just had so much fun writing it. And currently I'm writing another historical fiction standalone. I'm kind of enjoying these standalones, I must say. Glamour Girls was a standalone, and this is a work in progress. It's set in 1957, and I gotta tell you, I have a little trouble calling that historical. In Southwold. And so I am calling Southwold. It is very much just the town it is, but it's the story of 2 women who were friends growing up and reconnect, and one of them turns the house she inherited into a boarding house, and the other one runs it for her. And it involves an 11-year-old girl who is a victim of polio, shows up, and she's the ward of one of the women, a surprise to everyone concerned. And so it has a lot to do about, you know, this is after the first polio vaccine was administered, but she was 4 years old. It was 1950 when she got polio. So she's wearing calipers, braces, and she walks with sticks, and she's quite a girl. So that's what I'm working on now, and I'm having just a fabulous time with it.
Oh, that's wonderful. I'm looking forward to all those. So and I will say Murder Most Fair, Verity Kent book 5 comes out on August 31st. So that's next up for me. And I'm working on finishing up Lady Darby book 10, so which will be out next spring. So anyway, I think Everybody, we have lots of people saying that they're adding the books to their list and love your audiobooks. We'll have you guys check the comments afterwards. So anyway, thank you all for joining me, and thank you, Connie and Marty. This was so much fun to chat with you guys.
Thank
Thank you, Anna.
Yeah.
So fun. I could go on for another hour. I've got questions I need to ask you another time.
Yes, absolutely. We will do this again. So
Yeah.
anyway, thank you all for joining us, and I hope you guys have a wonderful night.